Today we are on, ooh, that's loud. Today we are on to, there's nothing I can do to make it quieter, is there? Today we are on to stated preference. I think it's chapter 7 in the book. No, I've lost the thing that's the clip on here. The Bumbling Professor. Okay, here we go. Today is on stated preference, lecture 7. And if there's time, my plan for the lecture is to go through the lecture and then do a sample survey at the end that, so we can think about some of the issues from a concrete example. We're going to talk about contingent valuation, which I tried to motivate last time, choice experiments, and random utility model. And I'll have 3 examples today, the Exxon Valdez, which is one of the main ones covered in the chapter, the Glen Canyon Dam, and the single track mountain biking. So contingent valuation. So this is a question of we're trying to come up with a demand curve. This is just a slide from last time. We're going to ask people to state their valuation. We're going to set up some sort of hypothetical scenario, and we're going to ask people what's their willingness to pay for this alternate reality. Usually it's let's have an alternate reality with less of an externality or more of a public good. We're going to make up something that will seem like a simple change and ask people whether they would pay for that or not. So we want to be careful that we're going to limit this abstraction. Would you like more Yosemites? Would you like more wolves? Something that's a bit abstract to people. And we're going to make this and sort of do what we can to limit it down to be like an economic decision people would actually make, like purchasing a good. And we're going to think of a set of prices that are relevant and sort of within the ballpark of what people can handle. So to motivate this, let's go back and think a little bit about more when we need to use contingent valuation. And we've already talked about a couple examples of environmental goods that we need to value that people might not ever use. So the 2 ones we've already talked about is Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, a huge amount of land, like the size of the state of New York or the state of Michigan, but probably none of us will ever go there. But we're still asking people to make public policy choices and sort of engage with policy about this amazing environmental asset that none of us will ever use. Directly use. We'll use the petroleum, and that's like an interesting one in that case. Or in the case of dams, we'll use the electricity, but we'll never use the environmental attributes of the resource. The other one is wolves in Yellowstone. So we talked about that in the beginning chapter. Hopefully we'll never see a wolf in Yellowstone up close. No, hopefully we will see a wolf in Yellowstone in our lives, but hopefully it won't be a personal interaction. And most people will never see a wolf in Yellowstone, but they may be somebody who lives in a city far away who still gets some feeling the fact that there's wild wolves in Yellowstone. It's something about having an intact, restored ecosystem in its pristine state. People can value that. So we have a whole bunch of different indirect actions that people do take supporting environmental goods that we can take measurements of. Right? People give donations to environmental groups. In the case of wolves in Yellowstone, people were giving money to the actual fund to compensate the ranchers for the wolves. Defenders of Wildlife had a specific fund you could give to that. They could probably still give to that specifically about restoring wolves into an ecosystem. But people across the board, they can join the Sierra Club and get the magazine. They can be in the Natural Resource Defense Council. People have a whole range of ways they participate in the provision of environmental goods through donations or participation or volunteering in environmental groups. As we talked about with the National Wildlife Refuge, it came up in presidential debates. It came up in presidential debates over a series of different presidents running against each other. And people were asking for votes, and the presidential candidates were signaling to their perceived voters based on decisions about environmental goods. I will drill an Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. I will not drill an Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And they're trying to get people's votes that way. And then people can sort of have some sort of like future idea. Some sort of like, I'm not going to go now, I'm not going to make a use value now, but I would have some idea like maybe some other time in my life I'm going to go to Yellowstone. Maybe some other time in my life I'm going to go to Alaska. There's have some sort of option value for some future use of a pristine wilderness. But importantly, there's lots of people that are going to value the environment without taking any concrete action. And this is what we would call non-use values. Somebody's just at home in their apartment, sitting on the couch, and they value that wilderness is there. So some of the terms are, we have an existence value. We just care about that something exists out there and it has nothing to do with us. So we just care that this pristine wilderness in Alaska exists. We care that there's a few wild and unspoiled places in the world. We care that there's a few top predators left, that the human beings haven't extinguished them all. There's some tigers in India, there's some pandas in China, there's some wolves in Yellowstone. Somehow it makes us feel like that's how the planet was meant to be. Another set of values are called option values. And this is something we talk about a lot of times with biodiversity. It could be that humans will change the environment and we'll never be able to restore it. And we want that biodiversity to exist for the future. One of the ways this has become popular option value is this idea of like in a pristine rainforest, there may be some rare plant or insect that has the cure for cancer. If we cut down the rainforest and cause those species to go extinct, we won't have had time to find it or explore in that way. So there may be a use value in the future. Let's just value biodiversity because it may have an option for later. Options are a big term in the financial world where people are buying and selling options on the future prices of stocks. So in some ways we could say people are valuing some future value of biodiversity. Another value is this bequest value. Or going back to option value, I already motivated this a little bit earlier. We were talking about the extinction of the bison in the American prairie, and we're talking about the O'Shaughnessy Dam in Hetch Hetchy and Yosemite. So these are both ones where you could have seen that John Muir in 1914 was saying you can't build this dam, future generations will not be able to see how beautiful this dam is, how beautiful this valley is. And this is related to bequest value. So people living now might want to make sure that some pristine wilderness is passed on. They want to make sure that a certain population of sea otters doesn't get destroyed by oil spills. They might want to know that Yosemite Valley will always be there in the future for people to see. Bequest is a giving on to the next generation. So we have this with environmental goods. We need to keep some of the wild nature for the future. All of these together can be called armchair environmentalism. You're not doing anything, you're not going out there, you're not giving a contribution, you're just saying that you care from within your home. But sometimes we want to come up with a value for that. Sometimes we want to estimate how much that's actually worth, especially when there's a lawsuit involved. So we have contingent valuation, where we, over the last 30 years in environmental economics, have done a lot of innovation on how to make this more robust and more concrete and more something that can be submitted in public policy or lawsuits that will hold up. This armchair environmentalism concept is very vague, saying that people value something. But to the extent that we can use economic theory to come up with more concrete estimates that we can use either in a court of law or in a public policy hearing to make decisions. I think I already motivated these. You're asking people to state their valuation by setting up something hypothetical. and you want to do it in a limited way and ask this set of prices. So we can go into thinking about examples. And when we go into thinking about examples, we need to think about how are we going to frame this issue? How are we going to ask it so that it's concrete to people? And how are you going to ask an average person, not somebody who knows about Alaska or knows about wolves in Yellowstone or who's an ecology student, ask some average person, because we want to get an average willingness to pay and multiply it over the whole population to come up with a consumer surplus measure. So we want to make sure we're getting the average person's perspective. If we only get the people concerned with environmental goods, we won't have a way to measure the consumer surplus across the average population. So when we do this, we're framing the question. We want to set up some hypothetical that's understandable to the regular person and has some hypothetical payment that's accessible to a normal person, that's in line with what they would pay for some sort of tax or some sort of fee, and ask people whether or not they would support this hypothetical payment. So we write up what's called a survey instrument. A survey instrument is basically like the paper form. This one is 40 pages long. But anyways, we're making up a survey instrument. And we want to only ask about a defined set of injuries. Here's injuries would be damages to natural resources. So we're not going to say something vague. We're going to limit it down to like this is a defined amount of pollution, a number of wolves lost. We want to have it sort of consistent with economic theory and comprehensible to basically anybody. And then we want to, usually when we do a survey instrument, we propose that we would do this hypothetical action. It's doable, it's technologically feasible, we know what the outcome would be, and this is how much it would be. This is how much it would cost. So we want to be able to propose something that's plausible to the normal person. Finally, the wording of the survey as we're reading it should be neutral. We shouldn't be saying, don't you want to save wolves in Yellowstone? We should be saying, there are wolves in Yellowstone, this is how many there are, this is how much it would cost to protect them, this is our program to reintroduce them. It should be neutral. We shouldn't have values laden in our survey. And then it needs to be conservative. A lot of people won't know what their answer is, they won't know how to reply, and we'll have to record those people as zero, having a $0 valuation. So we want to estimate some sort of lower bound on how much the values would be. So, and then there's a question of how to ask people about a payment. So this is when we're getting towards the demand curve. So there's multiple ways that we could ask people to make a payment. And we want to think about how there's different ways we could possibly phrase it. In this one that we'll see later, the Exxon Valdez one, we say, would you vote for this one-time tax? So that's getting at the sort of 50% rule. Would you support it or not? So let's say we're going to levy some sort of fine or tax on all of the people in the population. Where do we get to 51% of the people supporting? So a 0-1 choice, which a lot of times is a clear way to get people to respond to things. We could also say we're going to increase the prices. So if you go fishing at that Hells Canyon Dam, every time you go, it's going to cost this much. So it's going to vary with how much you use it. We could say we're going to increase the price of electricity at the dam in Hells Canyon to support fish. So the price of electricity would go up this much. Would you be willing to support that? So we could propose taxes on using the good, a hypothetical use of the good. We could propose taxes on a hypothetical use of something indirect. And then importantly, there's this question of is it a one-time thing or for the rest of, a long time? So the most simple in the Exxon Valdez case was this is a one-time payment that I'm asking you to make. Vote for it, yes or no. But you could also say you could pay $1 a year and save every sea otter in Alaska, because it's a stream out into the future. You could say the price of electricity would be 10 cents more for so many years, and that's how we're going to pay for something. The entrance fee to Yellowstone would go up by $5 for 20 years to support wolf reintroduction. So there's different ways you can motivate the choice. And how clear you would be getting a demand curve out of that would depend on how you motivated a hypothetical choice for people. So diving into our first example, the Exxon Valdez oil spill, 1989. What year were you guys born? Like 90? 92, 4, 5, 3? So this is a few years before you were born. 11 million gallons of oil were spilled in a quite pristine area of Alaska. It was a super tanker that was coming from the south end of that pipeline. Remember I showed you the pipeline was coming from Prudhoe Bay. South end of the pipeline filled up the super tankers. Do you remember how California was not connected by pipelines to the rest of the country? So the super tanker takes the oil down to Long Beach where there's a refinery. So you can think that your parents were driving their cars with this gasoline in it. So in that way that we are complicit. We are the people buying the gasoline and sending the super tankers through the Prince William Sound. Pristine area, lots of wildlife, and Exxon spent a lot of money cleaning up. Here's the crew cleaning up. They have steam hoses. They went out on the beaches with high-pressure steam hoses, and they tried to blast. They only ended up cleaning a very small percent of the oil, and nature was left to clean up the rest. And there's still long-term studies going on to see what the long-term effects are this much later. But this was a big moment for environmental economics. This question of passive use, armchair environmentalism, hit the big time in the lawsuit about it. So prior to the Exxon Valdez, this question of economics of passive use wasn't that well understood. It wasn't widely accepted. It was like a little niche of people proposing things. But in the lawsuit afterwards, the state of Alaska and the US government, who controlled some of the wilderness lands around here, were going to sue for natural resource damages. And they wanted to include in the damages this passive use number. This was a national story. It went on for a while. People were outraged. People from all corners of the country were saying, I'm outraged about this. Those guys should pay. And so it was obvious at the time that there was this, average person did care and have some value for this. So there was a huge attention to details and theoretical underpinnings that we won't necessarily get to, but it made this sort of like peripheral thing, contingent valuation, into something really legitimate. Economists from the mainstream were brought in to weigh in about how to do it well. And the economists who work on this that were specifically environmental economists launched their careers and became big out of it. So it's sort of a moment in time where this contingent valuation, passive use, became a legitimate big thing. So I have the survey here. I downloaded it. It's interesting to look at. It's very old-fashioned. Somebody had typed it with a typewriter. The initial description, you talk about environmental goods and government intervention generally. You say the government spends money on this, the government preserves wilderness for this, and you have some way to record the respondents' sort of perception of government spending in environmental goods. Then you describe Prince William Sound. There's this pristine natural area. I'm going to hopefully get to this later, so I can skip over this a little bit. Then you describe the wildlife that's there and how the wildlife was impacted, how many animals were killed. So what was the actual damage you described to people? And then their hypothetical plan they came up with was to have an escort ship. So every time a tanker goes out Prince William Sound, the ship will go next to it that will guide it away from the icebergs and the reefs, and if it does crash, it will be ready to clean up the oil immediately. So let's propose that there's this escort ship program, and would you be willing to pay a one-time tax to pay for this escort ship program? And it wasn't, this is hypothetical. They're doing this to get a measure of how much it's worth to the average American. in a court of law suing Exxon for punitive natural resource damages for the damages they caused by the spill. So there's a lot on statistics here. They select a random subset of counties. Within counties, you have census blocks. Luckily, the government does the census, so a whole bunch of the statistical framework is there. You just have to randomly take subsets. So they took a representative sample of census blocks, which are like areas of several city blocks or in a town, and they went to 1,600 households, and they got 75% of the people to answer the survey. And so importantly, what they're trying to get in their survey domain is the average American. They're not trying to get Alaskans. They're not trying to get people that do wilderness stuff on their weekends. They're trying to get average Americans and get a statistically representative sample of average Americans and ask the survey to them. So they randomize prices. Different households get asked different prices along a range, and different households have yes or no whether they would pay that price. So of all the people that answered, 64% said that they would vote for the one-time tax if it was $10, and only 34% said that they would vote for the one-time tax if it was $120. So then there comes this whole question of what statistical distribution you're going to use. So there's a whole bunch of questions on which statistics you're going to use and how you make that into the average value. But you can see they're coming up with some ranges, different distributions. One is $53, one is $80, and they have some sort of ranges of what the willingness to pay is average per person. And then they go and they multiply these numbers out by the number of Americans. Importantly, they can make it more statistically representative by doing what's ex post evaluation function. And I talked about this last time, where first of all you just have one y and one x, and you add a whole bunch of other x's, where how the income level of the household, education level of the household, how concerned the household is about the environment, and you can make your number more representative. So remember, these people are coming up with estimates that are going to be used in a super high-profile court case against the stable of lawyers of ExxonMobil, probably the best lawyers that money can buy, right? So this thing needs to be bulletproof, right? So this is why they're doing a whole bunch of things to make these estimates more and more accurate and justify every single variable that they put into a statistical regression. So what's consistent with economic theory? What's going to help make this estimate more robust? So you can adjust your total numbers based on doing subsets of people with different amounts of concerns, how well they're represented nationally. What they did was a sensitivity analysis. They did another few pages of the survey. Did people understand the survey? Did they understand the hypothetical example? Did some people vote no just because they're mad that somebody's at their door, or they're mad that somebody cares about the environment? So you can make sort of like ex post adjustments again. And these ex post adjustments actually increase the willingness to pay to around $50 per household. So these environmental economists in a big team with a lot of feedback came up with these big numbers for passive use that were somewhere between $2.8 billion and $7 billion based on how you interpret what statistical distribution you used and how you adjusted things before or after. So they're coming up with these billion-dollar numbers to make this fine on Exxon. We have the luck of having more hindsight than the textbook, but just to follow up on this is not in the textbook. At the time, Exxon spent $2 billion on cleanup and restoration. The survey was done in the early 90s, and the court case in 1994 found for $5 billion in punitive damages. Some of that was passive use, some of that was foregone recreation, some of that was foregone fisheries. Alaskan fisheries in this area are very valuable. So there was a whole bunch of different components of the punitive damages. In 2000, so Exxon battles this, and as I said, they battle with lawyers and with time. So 12 years later, they make it through the appeals court process, and they had the punitive damages reduced to half, $2.5 billion. They finally get to the United States Supreme Court in 2008. One of the justices, Samuel Alito, had hundreds of thousands of dollars in Exxon stock in his portfolio, so he recused himself from, so instead of 9, there were only 8 people, and they had a tie judgment 4-4, saying that whether or not these punitive damages were excessive. So they weren't actually battling about environmental economics. When it got to the Supreme Court, they were battling about whether the federal government has a right to take punitive damages at this level. But the Supreme Court found that they didn't. They said the punitive damages were too high. They sent it back to the lower court, and the next year, Exxon settles and pays up $500 million, right? So this is 1/10 what was found 12 years earlier by a jury trial in Alaska with all this expert testimony. And then 12 years later, they waited out. Their lawyers are turning and turning and turning. They end up paying a small fraction of this. It's a really interesting story. So, I mean, Exxon's saying, like, it's not our fault. It was an accident. On the other side, the captain was either drunk or he was downstairs asleep while the third mate was steering. They were outside of the shipping lane. They didn't have the right number of crew on there. So some of this is like, how do you establish the burden that a corporation is negligent when there's an accident? That's aside from environmental economics, but an interesting story. So moving on. So what we have here motivated with this contingent valuation question of would you pay for a one-time tax is you have a 0-1 choice. And this has a broad range of applications. We call these discrete choices. And there's lots of different discrete choice models that we use in this area of environmental economics. Would you vote for wolves in Yellowstone? Would you vote for this hypothetical ship to protect Prince William Sound? Last time we were doing revealed preference, we said, would we vote for cleaning up a sewage treatment plant in Chesapeake Bay? Would you vote to preserve this land on Long Island? So people often have like, here's our estimate of something we want to do. Can we get people to vote for this benefit or not? There's a whole field of transportation economics. Would you walk to school, bike to school, BART to school? So you can have a nested tree branching. How are you going to get somewhere? We have a professor at UC Berkeley in economics who won a Nobel Prize. He's sort of the father of this discrete choice methods. He's in Evans. So it's a whole area that gets applied in environmental economics. This is an appendix to Chapter 7 called the random utility model. You don't have to get too into the math. It's in the chapter, but I just want to motivate it by saying in our utility models, we have a utility for voting yes or consuming more